Thanks. Glad to be here again tonight. Thanks for coming back. Wasn't sure if anybody would. I don't know what you do for exercise, but I like to run. It's free, and that makes it easy for me to do. I don't have to go to a gym. I don't have to, go and show the muscles that I don't have. I don't have to do any of those things. I can just go outside and start running, and it's great. The thing is that I don't claim to be such a great runner. I just do it for health, right? I want to get where I'm going fast. I like to sprint, so I want to be over with this running bit as fast as I can. But in the Buffalo winters, those of you who are not from Buffalo, it's not so easy to do. It gets a little hard in the winter time for those who come from cold weather environments. It gets a little difficult to do some of that running. So what I end up doing is I got a treadmill, and it's in my basement. And I set this treadmill up years and years ago, and it was literally in my basement. At the time, my basement wasn't finished. All I was looking at were literally cement blocks, and I had the treadmill facing that, not facing a TV, not facing a window, facing cement blocks. There was a reason that I did that, because I was training for like a triathlon and for some adventure races and those kinds of things. This is back when I was young. Some of you are thinking, you're young still. Maybe, but not as young as I used to be. Neither are my knees. But I was training for this thing, and I thought maybe this would make me mentally tougher by just staring at a wall and running, right? So I get on this treadmill and I start going and going and going. And I don't know how many miles I ran, maybe 3 or 4 or whatever. And I am sweating like a church member at offering time. And by the time I'm done, I have got nothing to show for it. I have gone absolutely nowhere. I am in the exact same place that I was in when I began. And I am sweating and I am out of breath and I don't know what's going on, but I look around and my scenery has not changed one single second. That is depressing. Because if somebody says, hey, did you go for a run? I'm like, yeah. And I say, what did you see? Nothing. I saw the same thing the entire time. It's almost like sitting in your parked car in your garage for 6 hours and telling people you took a road trip. It makes absolutely no sense, right? I ran and ran and ran, and my scenery never changed. Now, I wonder if that's true of us at times spiritually. That in our spiritual lives, I wonder if we ask the question, what does life look like since last year spiritually? What does life look like from 2 years ago spiritually, or 5 years ago spiritually? I wonder if we could say either the spiritual scenery has changed, or maybe we say the spiritual scenery hasn't. I've sweat a lot. I've done all these types of things. I'm out of breath. I'm tired, but my spiritual scenery hasn't changed. If that's true, and it's true of all of us at some times in our lives, I just understand that there are spiritual lulls that we get into, and it just happens to every one of us. So I'm not talking just to you. I'm talking about us. This happens to all of us. And when our spiritual scenery doesn't change, when everything we see with the same eyes as we did 1 year ago or 5 years ago, and we see the same things the same way, and I'm not talking about the fundamentals of the truth of our faith. I'm not talking about that. Those have been true for 2,000 years, right? We embrace those. I'm talking about our maturity. I'm talking about our growth in grace. I'm talking about our ability to understand the mind and the heart of God. That when we go for long periods of time and our spiritual scenery doesn't change, that's a dangerous place to live in. You see, last night we talked about kind of our past and what it meant to look at stones that tell a story and being able to understand that these are things that ignite worship. Because we're looking back, we're remembering, we're not looking back, we're remembering instead of looking back. But tonight and today we've been talking about the present. And in the present context, I wonder if any of us are in a place where maybe potentially we are a little bit frustrated. Maybe, spiritually speaking, we get a little bit bored. We're not bored because we got plenty of activity to do. We better, right? We've got lots of activity to do. We've got things to do. We've got ministry to do. We've got activities to be engaged in because we want to make sure that we've got something to talk about when Brian interviews us at the conference, right? We've got stuff that we have to do. I'm one of those people. I've got a lot on my 40 plates that I'm juggling all the time. I get it. But I wonder if in our hearts, spiritually, if we might say, I'm sweating, I'm out of breath, I'm tired, but my spiritual scenery isn't really changing. Everything just looks the same. That's a dangerous place because what it can mean is that we start falling back into a place, listen to this, of being self-reliant. That's a place that we don't want to go, and it's not a place that we want to live because at the core of what it means to do this life with Jesus, it means that we follow. And you can't follow by standing still. You see, when we follow Jesus, it means that our spiritual scenery is absolutely and unequivocally going to change. Because what happens when we begin to follow Jesus is that we understand that following requires something, and here's what it requires: trust. You remember when you played those games when you were little? Follow the leader? Maybe you played it in some of your contexts, maybe you didn't. It's maybe an American game, I have no idea. But one person would be the leader and everybody would just have to follow them. Do you know what that required? Trust. Why? Because I didn't know where they were going. Wherever they went, and I followed. That's the life that we live with Jesus. Following requires trust. And if there are two words that could sum up Jesus' ministry of the gospel in the gospels themselves, I could sum it up. These aren't the only two you could choose, but I could sum it up pretty easily with these two words: follow me. When you look at the first book, the first gospel that was written by date, which was likely Mark, and you look at the first words of Jesus in the Gospel of Mark, what are they? Follow me. If you look at the last book written in the Gospels, which was John by date and by chronology, and you look at the last command that Jesus gives in the last gospel, what is it? Follow me. The bookend of the Gospels. Follow me, follow me. We should probably pay attention to that. If this is what Jesus has called us to, because following ultimately requires movement. It's implied in the term, isn't it? Follow me. It implies movement, that we have to be headed somewhere. And here's what I figured out: you can't follow by standing still. Now, I learned this because I've got two kids. They're 22 and 19. I know you're thinking to yourself, impossible. You're so painfully young. You could never have kids that old. 22 and 19, both college students, both baseball players at Cedarville University in Ohio. And when they were young, they used to like to go to these cornfields and go through these cornfield mazes. For those of you who are not from the United States, it's this entire field of corn, but they cut out pathways in there so that you can walk in there and get lost. That's how brilliant we are in the United States. We make places in farmlands where people can get lost. And then they make horror movies called Children of the Corn about this kind of thing, right? So we went to this cornfield maze, and my kids, my youngest was 3 at the time, which made my oldest, whatever he was, 7 probably. And they said, let's go, let's go. So they took off into the cornfield maze, and I started to run after them, but they were so fast, they were turning corners and going everywhere, and they were gone. And now I'm in the middle of a cornfield maze, and I'm lost, and I'm a bad parent. I have no children, and I'm personally lost in the cornfield maze. It's a bad scenario. Finally, I came to this clearing in the cornfield maze, and I stopped, and I'm just in there, and I wanted to just start yelling for my mommy and trying to figure out where I was and what I was doing, and I just sat on this bale of hay that was right there. Because I didn't know, I was hoping, okay, maybe my kids will come running by at some point. And I'm calling out, Trace, Tanner, nothing, crickets. That's all I'm hearing, right? And then all of a sudden around the corner, these two little kids come running. They're not my kids though. They come running around the corner and they stop and they're out of breath. And I just looked at them. I said, "You guys okay?" And they were like, "We're lost." And they looked at me and they said, "How do you get out of here?" Now, one of us had to be the adult in this conversation. And I knew it wasn't going to be them. So I looked at them, and in my mind, I'm thinking, you have asked the wrong man. I have no idea. I don't even know when I have a GPS where I'm going. Literally. This is true story. Pause. True story. One time I'm with my wife and I'm backing out of my driveway and I asked my wife, "Which way are we going?" And she answers, "We live in a cul-de-sac." True story. That actually happened. That tells you about my sense of direction. So there I am, and the kids have asked me, "How do we get out of here?" And I'm thinking, you've asked the wrong person. But then I just feel the theme music start. Dun, dun, dun. And I'm thinking to myself, I got to lead these boys out of here. I'm going to do this. And I said, "Well, fellas, I don't exactly know which way we're supposed to go, but I'll tell you this. You can't get out of a corn maze by standing still. Let's go!" And so we took off. I'm leading two kids that are not my kids. And I'm running through a cornfield maze, not having any idea where I'm going, but these kids are following me like I know exactly what I'm doing, like I am Clint Eastwood at Heartbreak Hill, right? I am headed out of this place. And eventually I got out. And I delivered these kids back to their parents. You're welcome. I'm here for them. I was just looking out for them. I knew my boys could get out because I've trained them so well, but I wanted to make sure your kids arrived safely. You can't get out of a corn maze by standing still. To follow means that we must move. It means we must advance. And our spiritual scenery begins to change when we start following Jesus. And what that requires is it requires trust. In fact, I want to show you that in the life of Peter tonight, in our few minutes together. Because Peter had to learn this lesson in a significant way. You remember Peter. He was fishing, doing his thing, right? Family business. Jesus came to the shore of the Sea of Galilee and told him to leave his nets and come follow him. And he said, okay. And so he did. For like over 3 years, he's following Peter. He's following Jesus. Peter is. He sees a lot, right? He sees Jesus do all that he's doing. He's seen him raise the dead. He's seen him transfigured on the Mount of Transfiguration. He got to meet Moses and Elijah. Hello, this is a cool setup for Peter, right? Peter sees all of this. He says he sees tons and tons of bread and fish from very little. He gets to see all of these things, walking on the water, all of these things. And then he comes to a place where he sees Jesus die. And in that, even though Peter had in his heart in the Garden of Gethsemane a real desire to follow Jesus even unto his death, he ends up saying he doesn't know him. And then after Jesus' resurrection, he shows up to Peter and to all of the disciples, but then there's a little bit of a delay before they see him again, and Peter goes back to fishing. You can imagine, right? He's probably thinking to himself, I'm just going to go back to what I know. Fishing, I know. And because he was so influential with the rest of them, they just came with him. Some of them were fishermen, some of them weren't. They were tax collectors, so they just sat on the boat and did nothing, right? Peter's out fishing one day on the Sea of Galilee. And he looks out on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, and he sees someone with a fire, and he says, wait a second, that's Jesus. And he jumps out of the boat and he rushes out to the shoreline and he spends time with Jesus, and Jesus has this beautiful conversation with him that for every time that Peter had denied Jesus, Jesus asks him a question. Do you love me? 3 times he asked him that question. And then right after that conversation where Jesus has restored Peter and shown him grace, even when Peter denied that he knew Jesus, then this conversation happens in John 21, beginning in verse number 18. Jesus said, very truly I tell you, when you were younger, You dressed yourself and you went where you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go. Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. Then he said, "Follow me." Peter's spiritual scenery was about to change dramatically. What Jesus was saying to Peter was this: follow me to your death. Could you imagine that conversation? He's telling Peter the kind of death he's going to die. Not when this is going to happen, just how it's going to happen. Of course, history proves that out, that Jesus was giving him a picture of crucifixion by which we know Peter died, except that he didn't get crucified right side up, but upside down, because he said he was unworthy to die in the same manner as his Lord. He didn't tell him when, he just told him what, that he was going to die, and he said this: I want you to follow me. This required trust, didn't it? You would have thought maybe by this point that Peter would have figured this out and that Peter would have already learned this lesson, and so this would have just been like, okay, right? It's not that easy when we talk about human beings. Sometimes we kind of, we make fantastic the people in the Bible and forget that they put shoes on and that they had bad breath and that they needed to brush their teeth and that they were hungry and that they got tired and that all these things happened, right? You don't have to look too hard with Peter, right? Peter had what we call foot-in-mouth disease. Peter said things sometimes before thinking. There was no filter, and he would just say stuff. And sometimes it got him into trouble. But he was a man of God and he loved Jesus, but here he's confronted with this reality of needing to trust, and you would think it might have been easy for him, but it wasn't, because you would think he would have learned that already. In fact, my mind runs back to a scene early in the life of Peter and Jesus' relationship, early in the ministry of Jesus. And you would think that through this story, Peter might have learned something. It's in Luke chapter 5, beginning in verse 1, and it says this: One day as Jesus was standing by the lake of Gennesaret, or the Sea of Galilee, the people were crowding around him and listening to the word of God. And he saw at the water's edge 2 boats left there by the fishermen who were washing their nets. He got into one of the boats, the one belonging to Simon, who's Peter, and asked him to put out a little from the shore. Then he sat down and taught the people from the boat. When he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Put out into deep water and let down the nets for a catch." Simon answered, "Master, we've worked hard all night and haven't caught anything. But because you say so, I will let down the nets." When they had done so, they caught such a large number of fish that their nets began to break. So they signaled their partners in the other boat to come and help them, and they came and filled both boats so full that they began to sink. When Simon Peter saw this, he fell at Jesus' knees and said, "Go away from me, Lord. I am a sinful man." For he and all his companions were astonished at the catch of fish they had taken. And so were James and John, the sons of Zebedee, Simon's partners. Then Jesus said to Simon, "Don't be afraid. From now on you will fish for people." So they pulled their boats up on shore, and they left everything, and they followed him. Isn't this a beautiful and interesting story? First of all, I think it's really interesting that there's a carpenter giving a fisherman instructions about how to fish. That's exactly what happens here when Jesus tells Peter what to do. You see, Peter, we find out, had been fishing all night, you see, because people who are from that area and know the Sea of Galilee, I've been there 8 or 9 times. What they know is that the best fishing happens before the sun comes up, and it actually happens best in the shallower water. And so they had been fishing out on the boat. And I'm not talking about shallow water like up to here, but shallower water, right? Maybe up to here. They had been out on the boat fishing before the sun came up, and they had caught nothing. This was the time when fishermen did what they did. They knew this was kind of the perfect time to be fishing. And so Jesus says, here's what I want you to do, Peter. I want you to go out into the deep water, and I want you to cast your nets out. He sends him out into the deep water. Why is that? Because trust is only learned in the deep. You don't learn trust in the shallow end. See, I know this because I watch people. I watch people at pools, and they sit in the shallow end, doing absolutely nothing except walking around or sitting around in the shallow end. If I were to go up to them and interview them and say, hey, what are you doing? Here's what they would say. I'm swimming. No, you're not. You are standing. That is not swimming, because swimming would involve your whole body and you're just hanging around in the shallow end. That's not swimming. You might call it liquid lounging. You can call it aquatic standing, hydro relaxation, whatever you'd like, but it is not swimming. Swimming happens down on the other side. I remember when my oldest son, who was just a kid, was taking swimming lessons. And they would get down in the shallow end where they could stand, even though they were really small, they could stand, and kind of keep their head out of water. And they would get these little paddle boards, and they would put their face in and learn to blow bubbles and then take a breath. And then they would kick, with the little kick boards, and everything was fine, because if they were having trouble, they just stopped and stood up. No big deal. But after they'd done that for a few days, one day the lifeguard blew the whistle. Everybody out of the shallow end and down to the deep end where the diving board is. Every kid starts getting out, and they start slowly walking down to the deep end, thinking to themselves, looking at their parents like, this is goodbye. And they just start walking down to the deep end. And then I see my son get on the edge of this diving board, and the kid he was scrawny. He just needed a hamburger. I mean, he was so skinny. And he was just standing there, and he was kind of shaking, and he was shaking. And there's the lifeguard in the water going, come on, jump. And he's just like, oh man. He's looking around and then he just goes, shoom, and jumps, right? Head goes underwater. Lifeguard grabs him, picks him up, and then says, swim to the side. And then it's this just ugly flailing, just rah! And he finally gets to the side, and he gets out, and I'm looking at that kid, and you know what I figured out? He just got a taste of the deep end. He doesn't want anything to do with the shallow end. He's living now. He starts thinking to himself, now I'm living. Because this shallow end business, this was just nothing but standing around. This was child's play. Now I am living. Why? Because trust, spiritually speaking, is developed in our hearts in the deep end of life. I wonder how many times we think we're in the deep water of trust and faith, but we're really just hanging out in the shallow water of self-reliance. I'm talking to you and me here. I'm not standing over the word with you. I'm standing under it alongside of you. I wonder how many times that happens in our lives. We think that we are in this deep water of trust and this deep water of faith, but we're in the shallow water of self-reliance. Here's the problem with staying in the shallow end. We don't really need Jesus. We can just stand around, walk around. Sometimes we like to get our friends in there and we talk about all the things that we're doing, and we like to splash each other a little bit and act like we're in the deep end. And we're not. We're self-reliant. We're depending upon ourselves instead of depending on Jesus. You see, when we go to the deep end, it's a critical time when we enter the deep water, spiritually speaking. It's a critical time. I would almost call it a time of crisis. Maybe not so much about being scared of the deep water of faith, but realizing once we get in it that we aren't the ones that are supporting ourselves. All of a sudden, we're in this deep water of faith, and we realize, I'm not drowning. It's almost like Peter when he was walking on the water going, what is going on? This is fantastic. And I know you're thinking to yourself, why would that be a crisis? When you get into the deep water of faith, why is that a crisis? That's awesome. It is. For then, until you realize something else. I'll illustrate. My family went to a water park, an indoor water park in Pennsylvania a number of years ago. Again, my kids were younger. And this particular water park had one ride, and it was called Hurricane Hole. Just what you want to get on, right? If you're a dad with 2 boys, you're like, Hurricane Hole is calling my name. You would get on this slide, and it would take you down and just screaming into this barrel of I don't know what, and you just start spinning around, and then you drop out of this hole, and you're completely, disoriented, and you basically almost drown, and the lifeguards laugh at you because you're a grown man who shouldn't be drowning, and then you get out, and it's like, it was fantastic. It goes like Mach 90 with your hair on fire into a spinning hole, and then drops you out the bottom of the hole, and it is a mess, and it's water, right? Hurricane Hole, that's what it's called. Very disorienting. So me and the boys do it a few times. And then we go get my wife. And we go over and we're like, hey, Edie, why don't you come ride this over here with us, this ride over here? And she's like, well, what is it? It's nothing. Just come on over. Let's just take a ride on this. And she's like, okay. So she comes, and the boys are like, Mom's coming, Mom's coming, Mom's coming. And I think they're liking that because their mom's doing it, but at the same time, they just want to stand out there and watch her when she goes through this thing. So she does this thing. She goes spinning around. I mean, like she comes flying off this slide. She's spinning around in this big thing, and then she drops out of this bottom of this hole, and she comes up. She has no idea which way is up, which way is down. Nothing. She finally gets out, and she's just like this. And I was like, how was it? And she was like, that was awesome. And I was like, I know, wasn't it? And she's like, yeah. And I said, let's do it again. She said, I'm never doing that again. No. I thought you just said it was awesome. She's like, it was. And I was like, let's do it again. She went, no. That's the crisis. That's the crisis we face when we get into the deep end spiritually. It is enlivening because we know that we are trusting Jesus, that He is holding us up, that we're not doing it ourselves. And then when that's over, we're like, that was unbelievable. I don't want to ever do that again. We want to go back to the shallow end. We want to go stand on our own 2 feet. We want to control instead of trust. Am I talking to anybody who understands what I'm saying tonight? Because I hope I'm not just talking to myself, but I hope myself is actually listening. I mean, look at Peter. He catches all of these fish, right? All of these fish. And what is his response? This is a record haul. What's his response? He falls down at Jesus' feet and says, woe to me. I'm a sinful man. Get away from me. Now, is that piety on his part? Is that holiness on his part? Maybe. And that's probably what generally we've understood that to be. I think something else is at work here, though. I don't think maybe it's as simple as we think. For instance, if we look at what Peter's response was to what Jesus did just a few days prior, if you back up from Luke 5 into Luke 4, notice what it says. Jesus left the synagogue and went to the home of Simon Peter. And now Simon's mother-in-law was suffering from a high fever, and they asked Jesus to help her. So he bent over and rebuked the fever, and it left her. And she got up at once and began to wait on them. That's awesome. And at sunset, the people brought to Jesus all who had various kinds of sickness. And when they came to where he was, they tried to, I think there's more up there. I think I may have missed some. Is it just not formatting right? Yeah. Here's the good news. I have a Bible. In case technology fails, I'm like, I've got a Bible. At sunset, the people brought to Jesus all who had various kinds of sickness, and laying his hands on each one, he healed them. Moreover, listen to this, demons came out of many people shouting, you are the Son of God. But he rebuked those demons and wouldn't allow them to speak because they knew he was the Messiah. Now, let me just ask you a question. That is right on the heels of this story about the fish. Which one do you think is more incredible? Which one do you think is more awesome? Which one do you look at and go, what? Fish, which is super cool and awesome, or rebuking illness, demons flying out of people, and confessing that Jesus is the Son of God? If I've got to pick one that I get to be a spectator and watch sitting on the sidelines, I'm going to Simon Peter's house and I am watching sickness fly out of everybody. I'm watching demons fly out of everybody, and I'm hearing those demons as they come out confessing that Jesus is the Son of God, and then Jesus telling them to shut that down because he doesn't want them to talk. I'm going with that over a big catch of fish. So why didn't, a couple of days before, why didn't Peter fall down at Jesus' feet at his house and say, Lord, depart from me, I'm a sinful man? Because Peter, when he caught all these fish, was confronted with something. Whether he was going to control or trust. You see, Peter, this is the biggest catch of fish like in the history of the Sea of Galilee, right? He's on the front of the Jerusalem Post, right? He's got a plaque in the Galilee Yacht Club. He can now buy a bigger boat. He can now take his family on a Sea of Galilee Disney vacation. He's got all of these options in front of him, and what does he choose? Trust. He chooses trust. Because Jesus says, don't be afraid, Peter. He was speaking to Peter's fear. He said, I'm going to teach you how to fish for people. We're going to see this just with people. And Peter, as imperfectly as he did, chose trust. Now, flash forward to the initial conversation that we were beginning to talk about after Jesus' resurrection, and when he's talking to Peter on the shore of the Sea of Galilee after he's restored him, right? Flash forward to that conversation and then remember what was said in John 21. Let's look at that again, beginning in verse 18. Very truly I tell you, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted. When you were old, you will stretch out your hands and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go. Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God, and then he said to him, follow me. Peter turned and saw the disciple whom Jesus loved was following them. This was the one who leaned back against Jesus at the supper and had said, Lord, who is going to betray you? When Peter saw him, he asked, Lord, what about him? And Jesus answered, if I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you? You must follow me. Peter was testing Jesus in this moment, and I find it interesting because he wanted to try and figure out whether this call that was coming on his life, on Peter's life, that he was actually going to have to die for the sake of the gospel. He was wondering, am I going to be the only one who has to do this? He's having breakfast on the Sea of Galilee, and Jesus tells him what kind of death he's going to die, and then says, you follow me, Peter. And Peter looks out of the corner of his eye, and he sees John walking over, and he says, Jesus, what about him? You can hear all of the things coming up in Peter's heart at that moment, can't you? What about him? I mean, why do I have to do this, and he doesn't have to do this? I mean, where was he? Remember when we were on the boat on the Sea of Galilee and a big storm came and everybody's freaking out, right? John's over there with sucking on a pacifier, wanting a cold glass of milk and looking for his mommy over in the corner of the boat. And there's me. What did I do? I saw you coming on the water and everybody's like, it's a ghost, it's a ghost. And I was like, no, it's not, it's Jesus. And I said, Jesus, if it's you, tell me to come to you on the water. And I walked out on the water. Where was John? Sucking his thumb. I was on the water. Why do I have to die? Why doesn't John? How about the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus? Remember when all those soldiers came for you? What was I doing? I pulled my sword out and I tried to cut Malchus's head off. I missed, but I got his ear. Where was John? And I've got to die. You can hear it all coming out, right? You see, the thing with following Jesus, the beautiful thing is that so many times when we follow Jesus, we get to do so with so many other people. It's a beautiful thing, really. You get to come together in times like this, in places like this, and you get to mutually encourage one another wherever you are in the world, and you can just be with one another and you can encourage each other as you are walking together following Jesus. But it's not always that way. There are times when Jesus will take you out of the crowd and he will look you and I in the eyeball and say, "You follow me." But Jesus, what about if I want them to remain until I return? What is that to you? You follow me. Sometimes the road in following Jesus will be crowded, and other times it's going to be isolated. But either way, Jesus' command to us still stands. You follow me. You see, when we get to that place, maybe this is a question that we could ask, because we got to know that trust is personal. We maybe ask this question: is Jesus worthy of your trust no matter what? Whether you just caught a big bunch of fish that you didn't think you could catch, and you knew it was Jesus. You knew that Jesus did this for you. It was remarkable. You knew you didn't have the capacity to do this. You heard Peter, right? We've been fishing all night. I always question whether or not Peter was actually a good fisherman, because every time I meet him fishing in the Bible, it's always, we've been fishing all night and we haven't caught anything. I'm like, what kind of fisherman are you? And then Jesus gives him this incredible haul. It's easy to trust him during those seasons. When we've got all the stuff, man, when God's just pouring out blessing upon blessing, maybe even miracle upon miracle, and we're watching God do all he does, that's the easy time to keep trusting. But what about when he looks at you and says, this may cost you everything, all that you have. You might give your life following me. Are you willing to go then? Are you and I willing to say yes then? Are we willing to trust him no matter what? Because, ladies and gentlemen, from beginning to end in the Gospels, the same two words are echoing off the waves of the Sea of Galilee through the course of 2 millennia, entering into our ears right now. Follow me. And following requires trust. And trust is personal. You follow me. Father, I pray that these words would remind us about our present state. Because too often in my life, and I'm sure in our lives, we get so busy with the activity of ministry, and we are running, and we are sweating, and we are out of breath, yet there are times where our spiritual scenery is not changing at all. Would you help us to remember that the core of what we are is we are followers of Jesus, and that as we follow you, our spiritual scenery changes. And as our spiritual scenery changes, it requires us to trust you, because you know where we're going even when we do not. Thank you that you do give us light, God, from your word. Your word is a lamp to our feet and a light to our path, but we thank you that that light does not light the whole path, that it lights a step or two for us so that we can continue to live as dependent followers of Jesus. God, I pray that you would help us to be those people, because ultimately, just like we heard with our dear brother in England, Sometimes our agenda is not your agenda. What you want for us, you have every right to claim for us. My guess is Peter would have wanted to draft a different ending. But you said this is how he will glorify God. May our lives be so consumed with the desire for your glory because we were created for it, because that is our purpose in living, is to bring glory to the one who made everything, including us. May we be so committed to that we would follow the blazing hot center of the glory of God in the person of Jesus Christ. And whenever he looks at us in our eyes and says, you follow me, without asking what I'm doing with everyone else, you follow me, that we would be those kinds of people, those kind of believers, those kind of missionaries, so that we may see fruit in your kingdom for your glory. Because what the world needs is not more of us, they need more of you. That your glory would cover the earth as the waters cover the sea. And that begins when we learn to really say, we will trust you no matter what. Because you are good, and you are worthy, and you will forever be worth it, with any choice that we make of obedience to follow you. May you write that on our hearts and breathe that strength by your Spirit into our lives in Jesus' name. Amen. Bless you, folks. Love you. Thanks for listening. Dr. Brian.